Hello dear listener, please subscribe to our channel. Enjoy watching. You ever have one of those moments when you realize everything you thought you knew was a complete lie? That was me, just a few months ago. My name's Jack, and this is a story about how my entire life got turned upside down and how I decided to do something about it. It was a regular Wednesday, nothing special. I woke up, went for my usual morning run, and kissed my wife, Laura, goodbye before heading off to work. She looked at me with those bright blue eyes, smiled, and told me she had a girls' night planned with her friends. I didn't think much of it. After all, she'd been going to these meetups every week for as long as I could remember. But something about that day felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it. That night, I got home earlier than usual. I thought I'd surprise Laura with her favorite takeout, Thai food from that little place downtown. I called her up to let her know I was on my way, but it went straight to voicemail. Weird, but I shrugged it off. She was probably already at the bar with her friends, phone buried somewhere in the bottom of her purse. I pulled into the driveway and noticed something strange. Her car was gone. Maybe she carpooled with one of the girls, I thought. But when I walked into the house, it hit me. There was this eerie silence, the kind you get when you know something's not right but can't quite figure out what it is. I set the food on the kitchen counter and noticed something else, her phone. It was sitting right there on the kitchen table. The screen lit up with a text notification, "Miss you already, can't wait for round 2." My heart sank. Suddenly, all those girls' nights started to make sense. The late-night meetings, the mysterious phone calls she took in the other room, the sudden interest in hitting the gym 3 times a week. It wasn't about her friends or her health. It was about him. I sat down, staring at the phone, trying to make sense of it all. My hands were shaking, my mind racing a mile a minute. I had to know more, had to be sure. I opened her phone. She wasn't the type to use a lock screen. In her messages, I found what I was looking for, an entire thread with some guy named Tom. Photos, texts, emojis that made me sick to my stomach. I couldn't believe it. This was the woman I married, the woman I loved. For the next few days, I played it cool. I pretended everything was normal, even when every fiber of my being wanted to confront her, to scream and shout and demand answers. But something held me back. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was shock. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the realization that if I played this right, I could turn the tables on both of them. You see, I wasn't going to be just another sob story. I wasn't going to let her and this Tom guy get away with it. I had a plan. And it all started with a little bit of spying. I became a ghost in my own life, watching from the shadows. I installed a tiny camera in our bedroom, the one place I was sure they'd eventually go. I put a tracker on her car and started keeping tabs on her phone. It wasn't long before I had everything I needed, dates, times, locations. And then, I saw them together. It was a Tuesday afternoon when I followed her to a hotel on the other side of town. I watched from my car as she walked into the lobby, looking around nervously. A few minutes later, he showed up. Tall, dark, and every bit the cliché I expected him to be. They kissed, right there in the open. My blood boiled, but I kept my cool. This was all part of the plan. They disappeared into the hotel, and I waited. After what felt like hours, they came back out, looking way too pleased with themselves. I snapped a few pictures with my phone, capturing the moment. They had no idea what was coming. I spent the next week putting everything together. I knew that just confronting them wasn't enough. I needed to make sure they felt the same humiliation and betrayal that I did. I needed to hit them where it hurt the most. First, I hired a private investigator to dig into Tom's life. Turns out, he was married too. His wife, Susan, was a sweet woman who worked at a local animal shelter. They had 2 kids. Perfect. It was like the universe was handing me the perfect weapon. I arranged a meeting with Susan at a coffee shop across town. She didn't know who I was, of course, but I had a feeling she'd want to talk to me once she saw the photos. I arrived early, ordered a coffee, and waited. She walked in right on time, looking a bit confused. I waved her over and she sat down across from me, her eyes filled with suspicion. "Who are you?" she asked, glancing around nervously. "I'm Jack," I said, sliding the envelope across the table. "And you need to see this." She hesitated, but eventually, she opened the envelope. Her face went pale as she flipped through the photos, her hands starting to tremble. He's cheating on me," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm sorry," I said, trying to sound as genuine as possible. "But there's more." I pulled out my phone and played the video I had recorded from my hidden camera. It was short, just a few seconds of Tom and Laura in our bedroom, but it was enough. Susan covered her mouth, horrified. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Because I think we can help each other," I said, leaning in. "I have a plan." We spent the next hour going over the details. Susan was hesitant at first, but the more I explained, the more she started to come around. It wasn't just about revenge, I told her. It was about justice. About making sure they knew they couldn't just walk all over us and get away with it. By the end of our conversation, she was on board. The plan was simple but effective. We would stage a confrontation, something public and humiliating. Something that would make them realize just how badly they had messed up. But that was just the beginning. The day of the confrontation came faster than I expected. We chose a restaurant, the same one where Laura and I had celebrated our anniversary last year. It was poetic, in a way. I made a reservation for 4 and made sure to let the staff know it was a special occasion. They had no idea just how special it would be. I sat at the table, waiting for them to arrive. Laura walked in first, looking radiant as always. She smiled when she saw me, but it was that fake smile I'd come to recognize over the past few weeks. The smile that said, "I have no idea what you're about to do." Tom followed her, looking a bit more nervous. Maybe he had a sixth sense that something was off. "Jack, what's going on?" Laura asked as she sat down. "You said this was a surprise." "Oh, it is," I said, smiling. "We're just waiting for one more guest." Susan walked in a moment later, and the look on Tom's face was priceless. He went white as a sheet, his eyes darting between me, Susan, and Laura. Laura looked confused at first, then slowly, realization dawned on her. "What's she doing here?" Laura asked, her voice trembling. "Why don't you ask your boyfriend?" I said, leaning back in my chair. The restaurant was full of people, and by now, they were all watching. I could see the staff whispering to each other, trying to figure out what was happening. "Perfect." Susan stepped forward, holding up the envelope. "Tom, what the hell is this?" He stammered, trying to come up with an excuse, but it was too late. Susan threw the envelope on the table, the photos spilling out for everyone to see. Gasps filled the room as people caught glimpses of the incriminating evidence. "You son of a bitch," Susan spat, her voice rising. "How long has this been going on?" Tom looked at Laura, his eyes pleading for help, but she was frozen in place, her face a mask of shock and fear. "Laura?" I said, turning to her. "Care to explain?" I don't." She stammered, tears starting to well up. "Oh, save it," I snapped. "I've seen enough. And so has everyone else." I stood up, grabbing my coat. "Enjoy the rest of your evening," I said, turning to leave. "I'm sure you have a lot to talk about." As I walked out of the restaurant, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It wasn't just about the revenge, it was about taking back control of my life. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. I didn't look back as I got into my car and drove away. Laura tried calling me a dozen times that night, but I didn't answer. I had already packed my bags and booked a hotel room for the night. I moved on. And while I'm not proud of everything I did, I don't regret it either. Sometimes, you have to take matters into your own hands. Sometimes, you have to become the villain in someone else's story to be the hero in your own. A year passed, and life returned to a sense of normalcy I never thought I'd feel again. I settled into a new routine, new job, and even a new relationship. Her name was Emily, and she was everything Laura wasn't: honest, kind, and straightforward. I made sure to be upfront with her from the start, laying all my cards on the table. I told her about Laura, about Tom, about the revenge. Surprisingly, she didn't run away. Instead, she looked at me with those clear green eyes and said, "Well, that was one hell of a chapter in your life. But it doesn't have to be the whole book." That was the moment I knew I had to let go of the past for good. I didn't need to keep tabs on Laura or Tom anymore. Whatever fallout they faced was no longer my concern. It was time to focus on what really mattered, the life I was building with Emily. One day, out of the blue, I got a call from Susan. We hadn't spoken since that night at the restaurant. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. "Jack," she said, her voice cautious. "I thought you should know, Tom's been trying to contact me. He wants to make amends, says he wants to put everything behind us." I sighed, feeling a mix of relief and resignation. "Let him go, Susan. People like that don't change. They just find new ways to hurt others." She paused for a moment, then said, "I think you're right. Anyway, I just wanted to thank you. Not for what happened, but for helping me see the truth. It was ugly, but I needed to know." "Same here," I replied. "Take care of yourself, Susan." And that was it. No dramatic closure, no lingering feelings of vengeance. Just a quiet acceptance that life moves on, whether we're ready for it or not. A few months later, Emily and I took a trip to the coast. We rented a little cottage by the sea and spent our days walking along the beach, collecting shells, and talking about everything and nothing. One evening, as we sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she turned to me and asked, "Do you ever think about what you did to them? Laura and Tom?" I looked at her, wondering how to put it into words. "Sometimes," I admitted. "I think about it less now, though. It was a chapter one needed to write. But it's over. It's in the past." She nodded, seeming to understand. "And you're okay with that?" "Yeah," I said, surprising myself with how true it felt. "I am." As the waves crashed against the shore, I realized that for the first time in a long while, I felt free. Free from the anger, the betrayal, the need for revenge. In its place was something much simpler, something much more powerful: peace. And maybe that's the real twist in this story. It's not about the revenge, the humiliation, or the aftermath. It's about finding a way to let go, to move on, and to make room for something better. Something that makes all the pain, all the anger, and all the crazy things we do when we're hurt worth it in the end. So yeah, that's my story. A bit twisted, sure, but with a happy ending after all. Because sometimes, the best revenge is simply living a life well lived, with someone who makes it all worthwhile. Emily squeezed my hand, and I looked at her, knowing that no matter what the future held, I was ready for it. The sun disappeared below the horizon, and we sat there in the gathering dusk, content in the silence, as the world around us slowly faded into night. If you leave a comment, tell us what you think about the story you heard. It's important to us and will help us find and tell stories that you find interesting. Thank you for watching us.